If you stand in the middle of the Mojave Desert at midnight, the silence isn't peaceful. It is heavy. It presses against your eardrums like the pressure at the bottom of a mine shaft. It is a silence that swallows screams, hides secrets, and buries the past under layers of shifting sand. But on the night of November 14th, 1997, that silence was shattered not by a scream, but by a roar that shook the windows of trailer homes 5 miles away. It wasn't the thunder of a summer storm. It was the sound of a man's patience finally running out. When the first patrol car from the Red Rock Sheriff's Department screeched to a halt at the end of Dust Devil Road, the deputies didn't find a chaotic crime scene. They found a tableau that looked more like a religious sacrifice than a felony. The building known locally as the Golden Cage, a sprawling neon-lit complex that had stood as a monument to the town's darker commerce, was gone. In its place was a twisted skeleton of steel beams and smoldering concrete, the air thick with the acrid taste of sulfur, burnt insulation, and something sweeter, more terrible, that no officer dared to mention aloud. The firelight danced on the desert scrub, casting long, frantic shadows, but one shadow didn't move. Sitting on the hood of his rusted 1984 Ford F-150, parked exactly 300 feet from the inferno, was Frank. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was watching the flames with the detached curiosity of a man watching a campfire die down. Frank was 62 years old. He had spent 40 of those years underground, breathing coal dust and blasting gel, working the veins of the earth until his lungs wheezed and his knuckles swelled with arthritis. He was a man of the old guard, Arthur Bill Frank, names that sounded like the bedrock of a bygone America. He paid his taxes early. He mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He had never received so much as a speeding ticket in his life, yet sitting there, illuminated by the destruction he had engineered, Frank looked less like a retired miner and more like a judge who had just delivered a final, fiery verdict. In his lap, his calloused hands cradled something small and fragile, a porcelain doll with a cracked face, the kind you'd buy for a child in a roadside antique shop. The deputies approached him with guns drawn, shouting commands that seemed absurd against the backdrop of the massacre. "Get on the ground. Show me your hands." Frank didn't flinch. He didn't look at the guns. He just kept stroking the doll's matted hair, his eyes fixed on the burning wreckage where 12 people, pimps, security guards, and customers, had just taken their last breaths. When Sheriff Miller, a man who had known Frank for 20 years, finally walked up and asked, "My God, Frank, what have you done?" Frank simply turned, his face smeared with soot and tears, and whispered, "I cleaned it up, Jim. I finally cleaned it up." To understand why a man like Frank, a man who built his life on the solid principles of hard work and silence, would turn into an angel of death, we have to look away from the fire. We have to rewind the clock, back before the explosion, back before the blood, to the quiet decay of a town called Red Rock. Red Rock, Nevada, in the late 90s, wasn't a town where people lived. It was a town where people ended up when they ran out of gas or luck. Situated 90 minutes north of Las Vegas, it was a purgatory of heat and dust, a place where the sun bleached everything white, the bones of cattle, the paint on the houses, and the hope in people's eyes. The economy here didn't run on mining anymore. The mines had closed in the 80s, leaving behind a generation of men with broken bodies and useless skills. Now the town ran on vice. It was the era of the legal brothel, a peculiar Nevada experiment where the sale of human intimacy was sanctioned by the state, tax-stamped, and regulated like the sale of liquor or cigarettes. But legality is a thin coat of paint. Underneath, the machinery was ancient. Just as the Romans built their lupanars, those grim wolf dens where slave girls were branded and shelved in cubicles, Red Rock had its own pleasure houses. They were windowless boxes made of corrugated metal and cheap drywall, air-conditioned to a freezing chill to keep the product fresh. They sat on the edge of town, invisible to the families going to church on Sunday, but glowing like radioactive beacons for the truckers and tourists passing through on the interstate. The girls who worked there weren't called slaves. They were called independent contractors. They weren't branded with hot irons. They were branded with debt, fees for room, board, medical checks, and management that ensured they never left with more money than they arrived with. It was a prison with an open door that no one could afford to walk through. For Frank, this world didn't exist. He lived in a small bungalow on the respectable side of the highway, a house that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Since his wife Martha passed away 5 years earlier, Frank's world had shrunk to a manageable radius. The hardware store, the diner, and his workshop in the garage. He was a man of routine, a man of tools. In his garage, he could fix anything. A broken toaster, a stalled engine, a leaking pipe. These were problems with logical solutions. You diagnose the fault, you apply the correct force, and you restore order. He was a hand of industry, a welder and mechanic who understood the physical world better than he understood people. He believed in the integrity of structures. If a beam is rotting, you replace it. If a foundation is cracking, you shore it up. He didn't know yet that some rot goes so deep, the only cure is to burn the whole structure down. The center of Frank's shrinking universe was his daughter, Jenny, 19 years old, with eyes the color of the desert sky and a laugh that was too loud for their quiet house. Jenny was the youth, restless, dreaming of a life that didn't involve dust and silence. She didn't want to marry a mechanic. She didn't want to wait tables at the diner. She wanted to be an actress. It's the cliché that feeds the buses to Los Angeles, the dream that paves the road to tragedy. Frank didn't understand it, but he loved her with the desperate, clumsy love of a father who knows he is losing the only beautiful thing he has left. "I'm going to Vegas first, Dad," she had told him that morning in August, packing her life into 2 battered suitcases, just to save up some money. "Then LA, I promise." Frank had stood in the driveway, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, wanting to tell her to stay, wanting to warn her that the world eats soft things. But he was a man of the old guard. He didn't talk about feelings. He just nodded and pressed a roll of $20 bills into her hand. "Check the oil every second fill-up," he said, "and call me on Sundays." "I will, Daddy. I promise." She hugged him, smelling of vanilla shampoo and optimism, and then she drove away. The dust from her tires settled, but the silence she left behind was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. For 3 months, the system worked. Jenny called every Sunday at 7 p.m. She spoke of auditions, of a job hosting at a fancy restaurant, of the lights on the strip. Her voice was bright, tinny through the receiver, but Frank, with his ear trained to hear the straining of an engine before it breaks, thought he heard a tremor, a slight hesitation, but he dismissed it. She was an adult. She was living her life. Then came the Sunday in November when the phone didn't ring. Frank sat by the receiver in the kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock growing louder with every passing minute. 7:15, 7:30, 8 psych. He told himself it was nothing. A missed bus, a double shift, but deep in his gut the miner's instinct flared. The canary had stopped singing. He waited by the phone all night. He didn't sleep. He cleaned his tools. He sharpened his chisels. He organized his welding rods by thickness. He tried to impose order on his anxiety, but the chaos was creeping in. 3 days later, the phone finally rang. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. The sound in the empty house was like a gunshot. Frank snatched the receiver before the second ring. "Jenny?" There was static, heavy breathing, and then a voice that sounded like his daughter, but stripped of all the vanilla and optimism. It was a voice small and terrified, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Dad, I can't. Jenny? Where are you? What's wrong?" Frank's knuckles turned white on the plastic. "I didn't know. They took my ID, Dad. I owe them. They said I owe them for the room. I can't leave." "Who? Who has you?" "The cage. The golden cage. Dad, please don't come. There was a scuffle. The sound of flesh hitting flesh. A man's voice, deep and bored, muttered something unintelligible, and then the line went dead. Frank stood there in the dark, the dial tone buzzing like a fly in his ear. The world he understood, the world of cause and effect, of rules and warranties, had just fractured. This was the minor incident that starts the slide, the pebble that starts the avalanche. Except for a father, a child's cry for help is never minor. It is the only thing that matters. He didn't grab a gun. Not yet. Frank was a civilized man. He believed in the system. He believed that if you pay your taxes and obey the law protects you. This was the first mistake. He put on his best shirt, the plaid button-down he wore to church, and drove to the sheriff's station. The station was cold, smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. Sheriff Jim Miller was behind the desk, nursing a donut and reading a sports magazine. Miller was a man whose waistline had expanded along with his apathy. He was the embodiment of urban apathy transplanted to the desert, a gatekeeper who decided which problems were crimes and which were just civil disputes. "Jim," Frank said, his voice steady but tight. "I need to file a report. Jenny's in trouble." Miller looked up, wiping sugar from his lip. "Frank, little early for a social call, ain't it?" "She called me. She's at the Golden Cage. She said they took her ID. She said she can't leave." Miller's expression shifted. It wasn't concern. It was the annoyed look of a man who sees paperwork he doesn't want to do. He leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning. "The Cage? Frank, that's a legitimate business. Licensed by the county. If Jenny's there, she's working. She was crying, Jim. She said she owes them money. She said they hit her." "Look," Miller sighed, standing up and walking around the desk to place a condescending hand on Frank's shoulder. "These girls, they get into debt. They sign contracts. It's complicated. And let's be honest, Frank, if she's working at the Cage, she's not exactly a missing person, is she? She's an adult. She made a choice. She didn't choose to be beaten," Frank said, stepping out from under Miller's hand. "I'll drive by later," Miller said, clearly dismissing him. "I'll ask Mama Rose if she's seen her, but I can't just kick down doors because your daughter got buyer's remorse on her career path. Go home, Frank. Get some sleep." This was the failed diplomacy. The moment the door slammed in his face, Frank walked out of the station into the blinding morning sun. The heat hit him like a physical blow. He realized then that the sheriff wasn't going to help. The law wasn't a shield. It was a fence, and his daughter was on the other side of it. The system failure was complete. Frank drove home, but he didn't go inside. He sat in his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled. He looked at his hands that could weld a seam so tight it could hold back high-pressure gas, hands that could navigate a mine shaft in pitch blackness. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a soldier. He was a mechanic. And a mechanic knows that if the foreman won't fix the safety hazard, you have to go down into the pit and fix it yourself. He went into his house and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. Underneath the winter sweaters he never wore, there was a metal box. Inside lay his severance package from the mine. Not money, but tools. A few sticks of industrial dynamite, old but stable, sweating slightly in their wax paper. A souvenir from a time when he cleared rubble for a living. He didn't take them. Not yet. That would be madness. He just checked that they were there. Then he went to the bank and withdrew $2,000, his life savings. "I'm going to buy her back," he whispered to the empty kitchen. If the law wouldn't work, maybe commerce would. It was a naive thought, a failed diplomacy of a different kind, assuming that monsters follow the logic of a marketplace. That evening, Frank drove to the Golden Cage. He parked his truck in the shadows, away from the limousines and the dusty sedans of the customers. The building was ugly, a concrete bunker disguised with stucco and purple neon. A sign above the door read, "Gentlemen's Club, private, discretion assured." The irony was thick. There were no gentlemen here, and the only thing assured was misery. He walked to the entrance. The bouncer was a slab of meat named Tiny, wearing a suit that strained at the shoulders. He looked at Frank, gray hair, plaid shirt, work boots, and sneered. "Senior discount is on Tuesdays, Pops." "I'm looking for someone," Frank said. Jennifer Wilson. "Nobody here by that name. Girls use stage names. Pay the cover or move along." Frank paid the $20. He stepped inside. The interior was a sensory assault. The air was thick with cheap perfume and stale cigarette smoke. The lights were dim, red and throbbing. Men sat at tables nursing overpriced drinks, watching women in lingerie parade on a small stage. But Frank wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at the eyes. The women's eyes were glazed, empty, looking through the customers, not at them. It was the 1,000-yard stare he had seen on men trapped after a cave-in, the look of someone waiting for the oxygen to run out. He moved through the room, showing a small photo of Jenny from her high school graduation. "Have you seen her?" he asked a waitress. She shook her head nervously and moved away. "Have you seen her?" he asked a bartender. "Put that away," the bartender hissed. "You can't take pictures in here." Then he saw her. She wasn't on the stage. She was walking out of a back hallway, led by a man in a cowboy hat. She looked thinner, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut. She was wearing a satin robe that was too big for her. Her hair was dyed a harsh platinum blonde, but Frank knew the way she walked, a slight shuffle, favoring her left foot, a habit from when she broke her ankle playing soccer in middle school. "Jenny!" The scream tore out of his throat before he could stop it. The music seemed to stop. Every head turned. Jenny looked up. Her eyes widened not with relief, but with pure, unadulterated terror. "Dad? No. Dad, go. You have to go." She tried to pull away from the cowboy, but he gripped her wrist. "Who's this, sugar?" The cowboy laughed. "Grandpa wants a turn." Frank didn't think. The years of arthritis, the stiffness in his back, it all vanished. He lunged. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a man who swung sledgehammers for a living. He shoved the cowboy hard, sending him stumbling into a table of drinks. "Jenny, come with me. Now!" He grabbed her hand. Her skin was cold, clammy. She was shaking violently. "They won't let you," she sobbed. "You don't understand." Before Frank could take a step, the world tilted. A blow to the back of his head sent him to his knees. Tiny, the bouncer, had moved with surprising speed. Frank tasted carpet and dust. He tried to stand, but a boot landed on his spine, pinning him to the floor. "We got a troublemaker," Tiny shouted. Then came the woman. She descended the stairs like a queen, entering her court. Mama Rose. She was in her 50s, wearing a dress that glittered like broken glass. Her face was a mask of heavy makeup, but her eyes were hard as flint. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice like gravel in honey. "Sheriff Miller said you might stop by. I'm afraid you're trespassing on private property and interrupting a transaction." "She's my daughter," Frank wheezed, struggling under the boot. "I have money. I'll pay her debt. Just let her go." Rose laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "It's not just money, Frank. It's a contract. She belongs to the house until she works it off, and with the interest, well, she's going to be here a long time. Take him out back. Teach him the house rules." This was the public humiliation. This was step 3. Frank was dragged out the back door into the alley behind the kitchen. He wasn't just beaten. He was dismantled. Tiny and another guard worked him over with methodical precision. They didn't break bones. That would bring an investigation. They bruised the kidneys, kicked the stomach, split the lip. Painful, humiliating, but not fatal. They threw him into the dirt next to the dumpster. Jenny was forced to watch from the doorway, screaming, held back by Rose. "Look at him, honey," Rose whispered, loud enough for Frank to hear through the ringing in his ears. "He can't save you. Nobody can. He's just a weak old man." Then, the final insult. Rose walked over to where Frank lay gasping in the dust. She reached into his pocket, took out the picture of Jenny, the graduation photo, and tore it in half. She dropped the pieces on his chest. "Go home, Frank. Before we decide to bury you in the desert, nobody digs holes out here better than we do." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The silence of the desert returned, rushing in to fill the space where the violence had been. Frank lay there for a long time. He tasted blood and bile. He looked up at the stars, the same stars he used to point out to Jenny when she was a little girl. He felt every year of his age. He felt the shame burning hotter than the pain in his ribs, the image of his daughter's terrified face, the sound of the door locking, the indifference of the sheriff. It all swirled in his mind. This was the moment. The death of the self. The Frank Wilson who paid his taxes, who fixed toasters, who believed in the rules. That man died in the dust behind the golden cage. He didn't groan as he stood up. He didn't cry. He wiped the blood from his mouth with his sleeve. His face settled into a mask of terrifying calm. "Nobody digs holes better than me," he whispered. He limped to his truck. He didn't drive to the hospital. He drove home. He walked into his garage and turned on the single overhead bulb. The light was harsh, casting sharp shadows on the workbench. Frank moved with mechanical efficiency. He took the metal box from the dresser. He opened his welding kit. He laid out the blueprints of the old mine shafts, blueprints that taught him about load-bearing pillars, about ventilation, about how to bring a mountain down on top of a seam without crushing the miners, or how to crush everything if you wanted to. He wasn't going to file another report. He wasn't going to offer more money. He was going to use the weapon of industry. He picked up a stick of dynamite. It felt heavy, solid. It felt like an answer. He looked at the clock. It was 4 a.m. He had 20 hours until nightfall, 20 hours to prepare, 20 hours to turn a pickup truck into a siege engine and a mining kit into a Judgment Day device. He sat in the silence, staring at the stick of dynamite, and for the first time in days, his hands stopped shaking. The tragic hero had left the stage. The Avenger had entered. The sun rose over Red Rock on November 14th with a cruel brilliance, baking the desert floor until the heat lines shimmered like ghosts on the highway. But inside Frank Wilson's garage, it was cool and dark. The only light came from the blue hiss of an acetylene torch. Frank wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a hot emotion. It burns energy. It makes hands shake. What Frank felt now was something colder, something geologic. He had moved past the public humiliation and settled into the death of the self. The man who worried about his cholesterol and watched Wheel of Fortune was gone. In his place was a technician preparing for a final shift. He moved around the workbench with the economy of motion that only 40 years of manual labor can teach. He didn't just throw explosives into a bag. He engineered a sequence. He took the sticks of industrial dynamite, sweating slightly, unstable but potent, and bundled them with duct tape. He wired them not to a timer but to a remote detonator he had cannibalized from a garage door opener. He wasn't building a bomb to send a message. He was building a tool to collapse a structure. He consulted the mental blueprints of the mine shafts he had worked in the 70s. He knew that every building, no matter how garish or fortified, has a spine. If you sever the spine, the body falls. At noon, he stopped to eat a sandwich. He sat on a stool, chewing slowly, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window. It was a mundane act in the middle of a preparation for mass murder. This is the terrifying paradox of the tragic hero turned villain. They don't grow horns. They just turn off the part of their brain that says, stop. He washed the plate. He dried it. He put it away. Then he went back to the workbench and sharpened a long steel crowbar until the tip gleamed like a needle. By 6 p.m., the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood reds. Frank loaded the truck. The dynamite went into a padded toolbox. The welding tank went into the bed, covered by a tarp. He put on his old mining helmet, the one with the light bracket on the front, and a heavy canvas jacket. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. He looked like a ghost that had clawed its way out of a collapsed tunnel. He turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life. He didn't look back at his house. To him, he was already dead. He was just a body moving through the motions of a debt collection. The drive to the Golden Cage took 20 minutes. The desert at night is a different beast. Vast, indifferent, swallowing the headlights' beams. As the brothel came into view, it looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the scrub. The purple neon buzzed, casting a sickly glow on the line of cars in the parking lot. Laughter drifted on the wind, shrill, artificial laughter. Frank didn't park in the lot this time. He killed his headlights a mile out and drove off-road, navigating the sagebrush and rocks by moonlight, circling around the back of the complex. He parked near the generator shed, where the hum of the diesel engine masked the sound of his truck door closing. The back of the building was ugly. Exposed pipes, dumpsters overflowing with bottles, and 3 steel doors marked emergency exit. This was where the hand of industry would do its work. Frank unloaded the welding tank. He dragged the heavy hoses to the first door. He didn't try to open it. He lit the torch. The blue flame hissed, hot enough to melt steel in seconds. Frank wasn't breaking in. He was sealing them in. He ran a bead of molten metal along the frame of the door, fusing the steel of the door to the steel of the jamb. He worked methodically. Weld, cool, move. He did this to the second door. Did this. Then the third. He was creating a bottleneck. He knew that when panic struck, humans behaved like fluids. They would flow to the path of least resistance. He was ensuring that path led exactly where he wanted it to. With the back exits fused shut, Frank moved to the structural pillars. The Golden Cage was a prefab structure, essentially a wide metal warehouse dressed up with drywall. The roof was held up by 4 main steel columns along the perimeter. Frank placed a bundle of dynamite at the base of the 2 rear columns. He taped them tight to the steel. He knew the physics. Blow the legs, and the roof comes down. Not instantly, but inevitably. It would create confusion, dust, and terror, the cover he needed. He checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. Peak hour. The parking lot was full. Inside, he knew music was thumping, money was changing hands, and girls like Jenny were being traded like poker chips. He walked back to his truck, picked up the modified garage door opener, and took a deep breath of the cool desert air. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the button. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a crump, A deep percussive thud that was felt in the chest before it was heard. The ground jumped. 200 yards away, the back corners of the golden cage seemed to liquefy. The stucco cracked with the sound of a gunshot, and the rear roofline sagged violently. Dust, thick, choking plaster dust, billowed out like a mushroom cloud. Then came the screaming. It started as a low murmur and rose instantly to a high-pitched wail. The lights inside flickered and died, plunging the windowless box into darkness. Frank didn't wait. He pulled his truck around to the side, revved the engine, and drove straight through the wooden fence that separated the staff area from the desert. He grabbed the crowbar and his heavy flashlight. He ran toward the cloud of dust. Inside, chaos reigned. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the interior in a strobe-like horror. Patrons were scrambling over overturned tables. Girls in lingerie were huddled in corners, coughing. The air was thick with white powder, making everyone look like ghosts. "Fire! Get to the back!" someone shouted. A stampede moved toward the rear exits, the exits Frank had welded shut. He heard the thudding of bodies hitting the steel doors, the frantic rattling of handles that would never turn again. The trap was sprung. Frank moved against the flow. He was a miner. He knew how to navigate a collapse. He kept low, shining his light through the haze. He ignored the men begging for help. He ignored the bouncer, Tiny, who was clutching a bleeding head wound and stumbling blindly. Frank had a map in his head, the layout he had glimpsed during his brief, violent tour the night before. "Jenny!" he roared, his voice cutting through the din. He reached the hallway leading to the private rooms. The ceiling here had partially collapsed, beams hanging like broken ribs. Debris rained down, wires sparked, starting small fires on the carpet. He kicked open the first door, empty. He kicked open the second, a man and a woman cowering under the bed. He moved on. Room 4. The door was locked. Frank jammed the crowbar into the frame and heaved. The wood splintered. He kicked it open. The room was surprisingly still. The structural damage hadn't reached this far yet. The dust was thinner here. On the small bedside table, a lava lamp was still bubbling, casting red globs of light on the walls. "Jenny?" She was on the bed. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't screaming. She was lying on her back, one arm dangling off the mattress. She was wearing the same satin robe, but it was open. Frank rushed to her, dropping the crowbar. "Baby, it's Dad. I'm here. We have to go." He grabbed her shoulders to pull her up. She was heavy. Dead weight. Her skin wasn't just cool, it was cold. Frank froze. The chaos outside, the screaming, the smell of smoke, the groaning of the dying building faded into a dull hum. He shone his flashlight on her face. Her eyes were half open, but the pupils were pinpricks. There was a crust of dried foam at the corner of her mouth. Her skin had a bluish tint under the makeup. She wasn't breathing. There was no pulse. Frank shook her gently at first, then harder. "Jenny? Jenny, wake up. Daddy's here. I blew it up for you. I came back." No answer, just the silent, indifferent stare of the dead. He looked at the bedside table again. Next to the lava lamp was a spoon, a lighter, and a syringe. The irony hit him with the force of a physical blow. The fatal misunderstanding. She hadn't died in the explosion. She hadn't died from the roof collapsing. She had overdosed. Based on the temperature of her skin, she had been gone for hours, maybe since the afternoon. While Frank was in his garage, carefully taping dynamite and sharpening his crowbar, Jenny was already drifting away. While he was welding the doors shut to save her, she was already beyond saving. He had brought hell to earth to rescue a girl who was already walking in the afterlife. A sob tore out of his throat, a jagged, ugly sound. He collapsed onto the floor beside the bed, burying his face in her stomach. The building groaned above him. A piece of drywall crashed down in the hallway. The fire was spreading now, eating the oxygen, turning the room into an oven. But Frank didn't move. He held her hand. He looked at the needle marks on her arm, the branding of the modern slave. He looked at the cheap room, the cage she had died in. The logic of his mission disintegrated. The escalation ladder had led to nowhere. He had climbed to the top only to find the precipice empty. Suddenly, a massive crash shook the floor. The main roof beam in the lobby had given way. The screaming from the back exits had stopped. Either they had found another way out, or the smoke had taken them. Frank knew he had to move. Not to save himself. He didn't care about that, but because he couldn't leave her here. He couldn't let her burn in this place. He couldn't let the golden cage claim her ashes too. He stood up, his knees cracked. He wrapped the satin robe tight around her body. He picked her up. She was lighter than he remembered, frail as a bird. He stepped out into the hallway. The heat was intense now. Flames were licking at the wallpaper. The air was black smoke. Frank pulled his mining mask up from around his neck and strapped it on. He took a deep breath of filtered air. He cradled Jenny's body against his chest, shielding her face with his canvas jacket. "I've got you," he whispered to the mask. "We're going home." He walked back through the nightmare he had created. He stepped over the debris. He walked past the bodies of men who had paid for pleasure and received judgment. He didn't look at them. He was a ferryman now, carrying a single passenger across the river Styx. He reached the hole in the wall where the lobby used to be. The night air rushed in to meet the fire, feeding it. Frank stepped out of the smoke and into the moonlight. The sirens were wailing in the distance now, a chorus of blue and red approaching on the highway. Frank walked past the stunned survivors who were coughing in the dirt. They stared at him. A man in a mining helmet, covered in gray dust, carrying a dead girl like a sleeping child. They parted way for him, terrified by the aura of absolute desolation that radiated from him. He walked to his truck. He laid Jenny gently in the passenger seat. He reclined the seat back so she looked like she was resting. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Then he reached into the glove box and took out the porcelain doll, a gift he had bought for her 10th birthday, but found in her room when he was packing her things. He placed it in her hands. He closed the truck door. He walked to the hood of the truck and sat down. He took off the mask. He took off the helmet. Behind him, the golden cage was fully engulfed. The flames reached 50 feet into the air, turning the night sky into a bruised orange bruise. The structure he had weakened finally gave up the ghost, collapsing inward with a roar that sounded like a beast dying. Frank watched it fall. He felt the heat on his back, but he was shivering. He waited for the lights. He waited for the handcuffs. He waited for the end of the story. The blue and red lights of the sheriff's cruiser swept across Frank Wilson's face, rhythmic and hypnotic, like a strobe light in a slow-motion nightmare. Sheriff Jim Miller didn't run toward the burning building. He walked toward the truck. He walked with the heavy, dragging step of a man who knows that whatever happens next, his career is over. He saw the inferno that used to be the golden cage. He saw the collapsed roof, the black smoke blotting out the stars. And then he saw Frank sitting on the hood of his F-150, looking like a statue carved from ash and grief. Miller drew his weapon, but the barrel wavered. "Frank," he called out, his voice cracking over the roar of the fire. "Frank, get your hands up." Frank didn't raise his hands. He just turned his head slowly. In the chaotic light, the sheriff saw the body in the passenger seat. He saw the stillness of the girl, the way her head lolled against the window. He saw the porcelain doll in her lap. The realization hit Miller like a physical punch to the gut. This wasn't a hostage situation. It was a funeral procession that had stopped halfway to the grave. "I'm done, Jim," Frank said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, carrying easily over the crackle of the flames. "You don't need the gun. I'm empty." Miller lowered the revolver slightly. "What did you do, Frank? Jesus Christ, look at that fire. There were people in there." "I know," Frank nodded. "I sent them to judgment. The law wouldn't do it, so I did." "Get on the ground," Miller whispered, the command lacking all authority. Frank slid off the hood. He knelt in the dirt, interlacing his fingers behind his head. He didn't look back at the fire. He looked at the tire of his truck. He listened to the sirens multiplying in the distance. State troopers, fire engines, ambulances. The cavalry was arriving too late to save the castle, but just in time to arrest the dragon. The investigation that followed was less of a whodunit and more of an archaeological dig into the strata of human misery. The fire burned for 6 hours. When the embers finally cooled, the forensic teams moved in. What they found turned the stomach of even the most hardened Las Vegas homicide detectives. They found the weapon of industry signature that Frank had left behind. The emergency exits weren't just locked, they were fused. The beads of welding material were analyzed and matched to the rods in Frank's garage. This detail changed everything. It stripped away the defense of temporary insanity. A man who welds doors shut isn't snapping, he is planning. He is ensuring that the checkmate is unavoidable. But the true horror, the irony that would haunt the case for decades, lay on the coroner's stainless steel table 3 days later. The autopsy of Jennifer Wilson revealed no burns on her lungs, no soot in her trachea. Her blood was saturated with heroin, enough to stop a heart twice her size. The time of death was estimated at 4:30 p.m. The timeline was indisputable. At 4:30 p.m., Frank was in his garage sharpening a crowbar. At 6:00 p.m., he was loading the dynamite. At 8:45 p.m., he pulled the trigger when Frank's court-appointed lawyer, a weary public defender named Sarah Jenkins, told him the news in the interrogation room. Frank didn't cry. He went still. He stared at the two-way mirror for a long time. The realization that his grand gesture, his apocalyptic act of rescue, had been for a corpse, seemed to break the last strut of his sanity. He had burned the world down to save her, but she had already left the building. "It doesn't matter," Frank finally said, his voice void of emotion. "She was dead the moment she walked in there. The needle just stopped the clock. I destroyed the machine that killed her." The trial of Frank Wilson became a national spectacle. It was 1998 now, and the media descended on Red Rock like vultures on a carcass. They called him the Miner of Death. They called him the Vigilante Father. The country was divided. On talk radio, callers praised him for cleaning up the filth that the law ignored. In the op-ed pages, he was a monster who appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner of 12 people, including a 19-year-old janitor who had just started his shift and a waitress who was working to pay for nursing school. Frank refused to plead insanity. He refused to let his lawyer paint him as a victim of PTSD or grief-induced psychosis. He sat in the defendant's chair wearing a cheap suit that hung loosely on his frame, looking like a man made of gray paper. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up. The courtroom went silent. He didn't look at the jury. He looked at the families of the victims sitting in the back row, the mothers weeping into handkerchiefs, the fathers staring at him with hatred burning in their eyes. "I am not sorry for the fire," Frank said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "That place was a tumor. It ate children. It ate my daughter. But I am sorry for your sons. I am sorry for your daughters who were just serving drinks. I was a miner. When you blast rock, you try to control the fall. But sometimes the ceiling comes down on everyone. I brought the ceiling down. I accept the weight of it." The judge, a stern woman who had seen too much violence in the desert, was unmoved by the metaphor. The verdict was swift. 12 counts of first-degree murder. 12 counts of arson. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nevada didn't want to execute him. They wanted him to disappear. They wanted him to be buried alive, just as he had spent half his life underground. Frank was sent to Ely State Prison, a maximum security fortress surrounded by the same white mountains he had grown up in. He became inmate Turnser 49201. The transition from the old guard citizen to prisoner was seamless for him. Prison is a place of routine, and Frank loved routine. He woke up at 5 a.m. He made his bed with military precision. He ate in silence. He didn't join the gangs. He didn't fight. He requested a job in the prison maintenance shop. At first, the warden refused, fearing he would build another bomb. But eventually, they saw that Frank had no fire left in him. They gave him a job repairing small engines, lawnmowers, generators, fans. For 15 years, Frank fixed things. He took broken, rusted machines and made them run again. He found a strange peace in the logic of gears and pistons. Machines didn't lie. Machines didn't get addicted. Machines didn't die of overdoses. If a machine was broken, there was always a reason, and there was always a fix. He never had visitors. The house in Red Rock was seized by the state to pay for the legal fees and restitution. It was bulldozed a year later, erasing the last trace of the Wilson family from the map. Frank died in his sleep on a Tuesday in 2012. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the prison doctor noted that his lungs were black with coal dust, a souvenir from a life before the crime. In his cell, under his pillow, they found a single photograph. It wasn't the picture of Jenny. It was a picture of the desert, cut from a magazine, a picture of empty, clean sand. But what of Red Rock? What of the legacy of the Desert Massacre? The site where the Golden Cage stood is still there today. It's a vacant lot surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The concrete foundation is cracked, weeds pushing through the fissures like nature's slow reclamation. The locals call it the burn. Teenagers dare each other to sneak in at night. They say if you listen closely over the wind, you can hear the sound of welding, the hiss of the torch sealing the doors shut. But the true horror is that nothing really changed. 6 months after the fire, a new brothel opened 10 miles down the highway. It was called the Platinum Palace. It had better security, thicker walls, and more cameras. The ownership was buried under a shell company, but everyone knew it was the same investors who had backed Mama Rose. The demand for flesh didn't die with the fire. The Roman slave girls of the modern era were simply moved to a new location. The buses from Las Vegas kept coming. The neon signs kept buzzing. The system, that massive, indifferent machine of supply and demand, repaired itself faster than Frank could ever destroy it. The tragic survivor isn't a person. It's the cycle. Frank Wilson's story is a warning, not a hero's journey. It's a testament to the terrifying fragility of the civilized man. We like to believe that there is a thick wall between the law-abiding citizen and the mass murderer, but Frank showed us that the wall is thin. It's as thin as the drywall of a cheap brothel. All it takes is the right amount of pressure, the right amount of grief, and the minor incident spirals into the death of the self. Frank believed he could burn the corruption out of the world. He believed he was the cleaning fire. But fire doesn't clean. It only consumes. It consumed the guilty. It consumed the innocent. It consumed his daughter's memory. And finally, it consumed him. As we look back at the events of 1997, we are left with a question that hangs in the dry desert air. When the law fails, when the system turns a blind eye to the suffering of the weak, what are we supposed to do? Do we accept the injustice as the cost of living in a society? Or do we pick up the hammer? Frank picked up the hammer, and in doing so, he became the very thing he hated, a destroyer of lives. The desert doesn't care. It covers the tracks. It buries the bones. The wind blows through red rock, scattering the dust of the golden cage, mixing it with the sand until you can't tell which is nature and which is the ashes of a tragedy. The silence returns heavy and absolute, waiting for the next man to break it.